A man sits in total darkness inside a high-security vault, surrounded by millions in diamonds. He is not there through violence or explosives, but through a game of social engineering and a hidden camera embedded in a fountain pen. Julian Vane has just cracked the Fort Knox of the jewelry world, and for one night, he is the cleverest man on earth. Julian Vane did not look like a man who spent his nights thinking about seismic sensors and Doppler radar. As he sat in a sun-drenched cafe in Turin, Italy, sipping an espresso that cost more than most people's hourly wage, he looked like a man of leisure, perhaps a minor aristocrat or a high-end art dealer. His suit was bespoke charcoal wool, his watch was a vintage Patek Philippe, and his eyes, sharp and calculating, were hidden behind a pair of dark designer frames. Julian's goal was never just money. He had money. His goal was the absolute score. He lived for the moment when a lock clicked open, the moment when a supposedly impenetrable barrier bowed to his intellect. However, his deep flaw was a classic one: hubris. Julian believed that technology was a servant to human error, and because he believed he made no errors, he considered himself a god among thieves. "The coffee is bitter today, Marco," Julian remarked, not looking up from his newspaper. Marco, a wiry man with grease permanently etched into the cuticles of his fingers, sat down across from him. Marco was the king of keys, a man whose hands were so steady he could perform surgery with a lockpick. "The coffee is fine, Julian," Marco grunted. "You're just on edge because the Belgian job is finally on the table. Are we doing this or not?" Julian folded his paper with a precise, crisp snap. "The Antwerp Diamond Center is not a job, Marco. It is a fortress. It houses the wealth of nations. To crack it isn't just a theft, it's an architectural conquest." Julian's life in Turin was one of practiced deception. He lived in a villa filled with fine wine and classical music, maintaining a reputation as a successful, if somewhat private, businessman. But every night, in a hidden basement beneath the villa, he studied blueprints. He studied the lives of guards. He studied the thermal expansion of steel. The plan had been simmering for months. Julian had already spent weeks in Antwerp, posing as a diamond merchant under an alias. He had rented an office inside the diamond center itself. He had walked through those heavy glass doors 100 times, nodding to the guards, showing his ID, and soaking in the atmosphere of the world's most secure vault. He knew the security was a 10-layered nightmare. There were magnetic fields that detected any change in the vault door's position. There were seismic sensors in the floor that could pick up the vibrations of a heartbeat. There were Doppler radars that detected the slightest movement in the air. To anyone else, it was a tomb. To Julian Vane, it was a challenge. "I've called the others," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, melodic hum. "Rocco is coming from Milan. Silvio and Enzo are already prepping the electronics. We meet in Antwerp in 48 hours. Marco leaned in, his eyes darting around the crowded cafe. "And the buyer? The one who tipped us off?" Julian smiled. "The Jewish dealer, as he calls himself. He's provided the seed money. He wants the stones, but I want the glory. I want the world to wake up on Monday morning and wonder how 5 Italians walked through walls of solid steel." This was Julian's flaw in its purest form, the need to be the smartest person in the room. He wasn't just planning a heist. He was planning a performance. He believed his crew was the finest instrument ever assembled, a symphony of criminal talent that could bypass any censor and outrun any police force. As Julian stood up to leave, he adjusted his cuffs and took one last look at the peaceful Turin skyline. He knew that once he crossed the border into Belgium, the ordinary world was gone. He was no longer Julian Vane, the gentleman of Turin. He was the ghost of Antwerp, and he was about to step into a shadow that would either make him a legend or bury him forever. The road to Antwerp was long, and the stakes were $100 million. But for Julian, as he climbed into his dark sedan, the thrill of the impossible was worth more than every diamond in the vault. Antwerp, Belgium, is a city built on the shimmer of carbon. Over 80% of the world's rough diamonds pass through its narrow streets, specifically through the square mile of the Diamond District. At the heart of this district sits the Diamond Center, a gray, unassuming monolith that holds more concentrated wealth than most central banks. Julian Vane arrived in Antwerp not as a thief, but as a ghost in a silk tie. He moved into a small, nondescript apartment 3 blocks from the center. His teammates arrived separately, filtering into the city like fog. Rocco, the monster, was the first to report. He was a man of few words and immense strength, capable of holding a heavy drill steady for hours or climbing a vertical vent without a harness. Silvio, the genius, followed, carrying a suitcase full of custom-built circuit boards and bypass modules. Finally, Enzo, the specialist, arrived with his surveillance gear. The inciting incident had happened weeks prior in Italy, when a mysterious intermediary, known only as the dealer, had shown Julian a set of photos. They weren't just photos of diamonds. They were photos of the Diamond Center's internal security blueprints. This was the invitation Julian couldn't refuse. Someone on the inside wanted this vault cracked, and they had chosen Julian to do it. "Look at this," Silvio said, spreading a thermal map across the table in their safe house. "The vault is underground, 2 stories down. The door is 2 tons of reinforced steel with a combination lock that has 100 million possible sequences. It's also on a timer. Even if you have the code, the door won't open until the morning." Julian paced the room, his mind already whirring. "The code is irrelevant. We won't be guessing it. We'll be watching it." Enzo chimed in. "I've already planted the pinhole camera in the overhead light above the keypad. Every time the head of security enters the code, we get a high-definition feed. We've been recording for 3 days. We have the sequence." The crew stared at the map. The sheer scale of the obstacles was staggering. 1. Magnetic seals, 2 sensors on the door that trigger an alarm if separated. 2. Seismic sensors, embedded in the concrete to detect drilling or vibration. 3. Doppler radar, to detect movement in the vault's air. 4. Infrared heat sensors, to detect body heat. 5. The light sensor, to detect if a flashlight is turned on inside. "It's a suicide mission," Marco whispered, though his eyes were gleaming. "It's an invitation to greatness," Julian corrected. "We'll spend the next 3 months practicing. In that time we built the vault, every inch of it. I found an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Rocco, you handle the construction. Silvio, you build the sensors. I want us to be able to move through that vault in total darkness without triggering a single alarm." This was where Julian's obsession took hold. He didn't just want to know the vault. He wanted to own it. He spent his days at the Diamond Center, chatting with the guards, bringing them coffee, and subtly observing their routines. He learned that the guards were creatures of habit. They relied on the machines, and because they relied on the machines, they were lazy. "The machines don't make mistakes," Julian told his crew that night. "But the people who set them do. We are going to find the gap between the technology and the human. That is where we live." But as Julian lay in bed that night, the weight of the impossible began to press down. He knew the stakes. If they were caught, it wasn't just prison. It was the total destruction of his carefully crafted life. His hubris told him he was untouchable, but a small, quiet part of his mind reminded him that even the most perfect diamond has a flaw. The plan was set. The invitation had been accepted. Now, Julian Vane and his crew would have to become more than thieves. They would have to become ghosts. The warehouse was a cavernous, rotting structure on the industrial outskirts of Antwerp, a place where the air smelled of damp concrete and old grease. Inside, however, was a marvel of criminal engineering. Under Julian Vane's obsessive direction, the crew had constructed a perfect, 1-to-1 replica of the Antwerp Diamond Center's vault. 29 seconds, Rocco, Julian said, clicking a stopwatch. "Too slow. If you're still in the frame when the infrared sweep resets, the silent alarm at the police station across the street will trigger before you can even reach for your bag." Rocco, sweat pouring down his massive frame, grunted and reset his position. They weren't just practicing a robbery. They were rehearsing a ballet of precision. Julian had dubbed them the School of Turin, a title that reflected his belief that thievery was a high art form that required academic rigor. While Rocco practiced the physical maneuvers, Silvio, the genius, was hunched over a workbench cluttered with gutted electronics and soldering irons. He was the one who had to solve the Doppler problem. The vault was equipped with sensors that emitted high-frequency sound waves. Any movement, even the flutter of a heartbeat, would disrupt the waves and trip the alarm. "I've got it, Julian," Silvio announced, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He held up a small, unassuming gray box. "It's a frequency jammer, but it's subtle. It doesn't kill the Doppler radar. It mimics the stillness of an empty room. We walk behind the shield, and the machine thinks the air is as stagnant as a tomb. Julian nodded, but his mind was already on the next layer. And the magnetic seals on the door? Marco, the king of keys, stepped forward. He had spent the last 72 hours staring at high-resolution photos of the vault's massive bolts. The magnets are the easy part. We don't break the seal. We bridge it. If we slide a thin sheet of magnetized steel between the sensors before we open the door, the circuit remains closed. The system will think the door is shut even when we're standing inside it, knee-deep in diamonds. The training was grueling. Julian forced them to perform the entire heist in total darkness, wearing night vision goggles that turned the world into a grainy, ghostly green. He would randomly throw obstacles in their path, a simulated power flicker, a mock guard patrol, testing their nerves. Julian's deep flaw, his hubris, began to manifest as a form of perfectionism that bordered on the tyrannical. He wouldn't allow for a 1% margin of error. He believed that if the plan was perfect, the universe would have no choice but to let them succeed. He saw himself as the conductor of a silent orchestra, and his crew was beginning to feel the strain of his baton. "We aren't machines, Julian," Enzo, the specialist, muttered one night after a 10-hour session. "We're going to be tired. We're only human." Julian turned to him, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of a single work lamp. "That is exactly why we train until the human element is gone. In that vault, there is no Enzo. There is only the specialist. If you want to be human, go back to Turin and sell insurance. Here, we are ghosts." While the crew labored in the warehouse, Julian Vane lived a double life that would have exhausted a lesser man. By day, he was the merchant of Turin, a regular fixture in the Antwerp Diamond Center. He had successfully established himself as a legitimate trader, renting office space on the third floor, directly above the vault's control room. This was the invisible ghost phase. Julian spent his afternoons in the building's common areas, sipping espresso and engaging in social engineering. He knew the names of the guards' children. He knew which technician was lazy about checking the backup batteries for the seismic sensors. He was so well integrated into the building's ecosystem that the security staff stopped seeing him as a visitor and started seeing him as part of the furniture. "The pen is mightier than the sword," Julian whispered to himself as he adjusted a high-end fountain pen in his breast pocket. Inside that pen was a microscopic camera. Every day, Julian would find a reason to linger near the security desk or the vault entrance. He recorded the guards entering their personal access codes. He filmed the way the keys turned in the locks. He even managed to capture the all-clear signal the guards gave each other via radio. Back at the safe house, Enzo would take the footage and obsessively analyze it. The head of security, Van de Kamp, uses his birthday for the keypad, 0512. The secondary guard doesn't even look when he types. He uses a swipe pattern that we've already mapped. But the most critical piece of intelligence came when Julian observed a routine maintenance check on the vault's light sensors. He realized that the sensors were calibrated to detect white light, the kind from a flashlight or the overheads. "Silvio," Julian said, returning to the warehouse that evening, "if we use light in the infrared spectrum, the sensors won't see it, right?" "Correct," Silvio replied. "To the sensor, the room will remain pitch black. But with your goggles, it will look like high noon." The plan was tightening like a noose. They had the codes, the jammers, the magnetic bridges, and the thermal shields. Julian had mapped every camera's blind spot to the inch. He had become a master of the Diamond Center's heartbeat, knowing exactly when the guards changed shifts and when the cleaning crew finished their rounds. However, the conflict was no longer just the vault. It was the rising tension within the crew. The stakes were becoming real. They were days away from the point of no return. "The dealer wants an update," Julian told them, his voice cold and steady. "He's heard the police are stepping up patrols in the district. He wants to know if we're ready." Julian looked around the room at his team, the men he had molded into a precision instrument. He felt a surge of that dangerous pride, the belief that he had finally conquered chance itself. "Tell him we aren't just ready," Julian said. "Tell him the diamonds are already ours. They just don't know it yet." He didn't see the small, nervous glance Marco exchanged with Enzo. He didn't notice the way Silvio's hands shook as he packed the jammers. Julian Vane was blinded by his own brilliance, convinced that the absolute score was his destiny. He was the invisible ghost, and he was about to walk through walls. February 15th, 2003, arrived with a biting Belgian chill that seemed to seep through the very brickwork of the Diamond District. The city of Antwerp was quiet, settled into the deep, rhythmic slumber of a Saturday night. For the world, it was just another weekend. For Julian Vane, it was the opening night of the greatest performance of his life. The crew moved with the silent synchronization of a clockwork mechanism. Julian, dressed in a tactical black suit that cost more than a mid-sized car, led the way into the Diamond Center through the rear service entrance. He had spent months ensuring this lock was soft, a simple mechanical override that Marco handled in under 4 seconds. "The Doppler is live," Silvio whispered into his comms, his voice a ghost of a sound. He held the frequency jammer like a holy relic. As they descended into the bowels of the building, the air grew colder, sterilized by the hum of high-end climate control. They reached the antechamber, the small room directly preceding the vault door. This was the first true test. The Doppler radar and the infrared sensors were active here. Julian signaled for the thermal shield. Rocco and Enzo unfurled a massive, custom-built blanket made of lead-lined polyester and mylar. To the infrared sensors, the blanket looked like a wall of cold air. To the Doppler radar, Silvio's jammer projected a loop of stillness. Behind this invisible curtain, the crew moved like shadows. Julian reached the vault door. It was a monstrous slab of reinforced steel, cold to the touch and radiating a sense of absolute defiance. Julian didn't see an obstacle. He saw a partner in a dance. "Magnets," Julian commanded. Marco stepped forward with the magnetic bridges. With the steady hands of a bomb technician, he slid the thin magnetized plates between the door and the frame. The circuit remained closed. The security system in the police station across the street continued to report that the door was sealed tight. Then came the combination. Julian recalled the footage from the pinhole camera, the precise movements of the head of security's fingers. He dialed the sequence. 4 numbers, 100 million possibilities, but Julian only needed one truth. Click. The sound was small, but in the silence of the underground corridor, it sounded like a gunshot. The 2-ton door swung open with a pneumatic hiss. Julian stepped into the vault, his night vision goggles painting the world in a vivid, emerald glow. He was inside the heart of the fortress. He was the only man in the world who had truly conquered the impenetrable. The vault was a cathedral of steel, lined from floor to ceiling with 189 safe deposit boxes. In the green light of Julian's goggles, the brass locks of the boxes glittered like eyes. "We have 4 hours," Julian said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "Rocco, start with the bottom tier. Marco, middle. I take the top. Enzo, watch the light sensor. If a single photon of white light hits that wall, we're dead." The specialist stood by the door, holding a slab of black foam over the light sensor while Silvio monitored the Doppler jammer. The work was grueling. This wasn't the cinematic Ocean's 11 montage. This was a blue-collar labor of the highest order. Rocco used a manual bolt puller to snap the locks off the boxes. The sound of snapping metal was rhythmic. Crack, slide, dump. Julian reached into the first box. He pulled out a leather pouch, unzipped it, and felt a waterfall of cold, hard light spill over his gloved hands. Rough diamonds. Thousands of them. He didn't admire them. He didn't have time for the hubris of the merchant now. He dumped them into a heavy-duty canvas bag and moved to the next. 1 hour passed. Then 2. The bags were becoming heavy, laden with gold bars, watches, and bags of diamonds that represented the life savings of entire families and the inventory of international corporations. "Julian," Silvio's voice crackled. "The Doppler is fluctuating. The sensors are picking up the heat from our exertion. We're pushing the limits of the shield." Julian looked at his team. Rocco was drenched in sweat, his muscles trembling from the strain of pulling nearly 100 locks. Marco's fingers were bleeding. But Julian, driven by his relentless perfectionism, refused to stop. 10 more boxes, Julian ordered. "We have enough," Enzo hissed from the doorway. "The bags are full. We need to move." 10 more, Julian repeated. He wanted to empty the vault. He wanted the headline to read that nothing was left. He wanted total victory. In those final 10 boxes, they found the dealer's prize, a velvet box containing a blue diamond the size of a walnut. Julian tucked it into his breast pocket, right next to his heart. As they began the extraction, the tension reached a fever pitch. They had to back out exactly as they had entered, resetting the magnets, closing the vault door, and moving behind the thermal shield. Every step was a gamble. They exited the building at 5:30 a.m., just as the first hint of gray light touched the Antwerp skyline. They climbed into their nondescript van, $100 million in diamonds resting on the floorboards like common gravel. Julian looked at his crew. They were exhausted, terrified, and rich beyond their wildest dreams. Julian felt a surge of triumph that was almost intoxicating. He had done it. He had beaten the machines. He had beaten the world. He didn't notice the small, crumpled receipt from a grocery store that had fallen out of Marco's pocket during the frantic loading of the bags. He didn't see the half-eaten salami sandwich that Rocco had tossed into a trash bag in the back of the van. Julian Vane was looking at the horizon, already imagining his legendary status. He believed he was a ghost, but he had left a trail of human debris behind him. The adrenaline that had sustained the crew through the dark hours of the vault was now curdling into a toxic mix of exhaustion and paranoia. As the van sped away from the Antwerp Diamond District, the silence inside the vehicle was heavy. $100 million in diamonds laid in canvas bags at their feet, but the weight of the crime felt heavier than the stones. Julian Vane sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. His mind was already miles away, calculating the logistics of the cooling-off period in Italy. He was the architect of a masterpiece, and in his mind, the masterpiece was finished. But the masterpiece was about to be ruined by a single, mundane act of human fatigue. "We need to get rid of the evidence," Rocco muttered from the back. He was surrounded by the debris of the heist: discarded black tape, empty tool wrappers, and a large plastic trash bag containing the remnants of their final meals and the surveillance notes. "Not here," Julian snapped. "We wait until we're across the border. We dispose of it in a high-traffic area where it gets lost in the city's waste." "Precision, Rocco. Stay focused." But Rocco was past the point of precision. His body ached, and his nerves were frayed to a thin wire. As they reached a secluded, wooded area near the highway leading toward the French border, the van slowed. Rocco, driven by a sudden, irrational need to be rid of the stink of the crime, grabbed the trash bag. "I'm dumping it here," Rocco said, his hand on the door handle. "No one comes out here. It's a forest, Julian. It'll be buried in leaves before anyone finds it." "Rocco, don't." Julian started, but the door was already open. With a heavy heave, Rocco tossed the bag into the dense brush of the Belgian roadside. It tumbled down a small embankment, snagging on a branch and spilling a few contents onto the dirt. Rocco slammed the door, and the van sped off. Julian felt a cold shiver of intuition, but his hubris quickly suppressed it. "It's just trash," he told himself. "The police are looking for masterminds, not garbage." Inside that bag, buried under a half-eaten salami sandwich and a discarded soda can, was a receipt from a local Antwerp grocery store. On the back of that receipt, in a moment of boredom during a surveillance shift, Enzo had scribbled a list of security code sequences. The discovery of the heist of the century sent shockwaves through the global diamond industry. When the guards opened the vault on Monday morning, they found a tomb of empty boxes and scattered velvet linings. The impenetrable fortress had been gutted. The Belgian police, led by a meticulous detective named Verheegen, were initially baffled. There was no forced entry on the main vault door. No alarms had triggered. No cameras had captured a single face. It was the work of ghosts. "They didn't just rob us," Verheegen noted, looking at the precision with which the magnetic seals had been bypassed. "They studied us. They lived here." The breakthrough in the case didn't come from a high-tech lab or a satellite trace. It came from a local hunter who lived near the highway. He had spotted a strange bag of trash in the woods and, thinking it might contain evidence of illegal poaching, called the authorities. When Verheegen opened the bag, he didn't find poachers. He found a piece of a School of Turin puzzle. He found the grocery receipt. The receipt led them to a store 3 blocks from the Diamond Center. The store's security footage, a system Julian had overlooked because it wasn't part of the fortress, showed Julian Vane, the merchant of Turin, buying the very salami found in the sandwich. While the police were connecting the dots, Julian was in Italy, celebrating. He had hidden the diamonds in a safe house in Milan, planning to wait a year before moving them. He was still playing the part of the gentleman, hosting dinners and discussing art. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he didn't notice the strange cars parked at the end of his driveway. The net didn't just close, it snapped shut. Using the DNA from the sandwich and the handwriting on the receipt, Verheegen coordinated with the Italian police. Julian was at breakfast, his silk robe tied perfectly, a cup of espresso in his hand, when the front door of his villa was kicked in. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply sat there, the cup frozen halfway to his lips, as a dozen armed officers swarmed his sanctuary. "Julian Vane?" Verheegen asked, stepping into the room. Julian set the cup down with a steady hand. His mind scrambled to find the flaw, the one variable he hadn't accounted for. He thought of the Doppler jammers, the seismic sensors, the magnetic bridges. He had conquered the most advanced technology on the planet. "The sandwich," Verheegen said, almost pityingly. "You were caught by a salami sandwich." In that moment, Julian's hubris shattered. He realized that he hadn't been defeated by a better mind or a better machine. He had been defeated by the one thing he couldn't control, the mundane, clumsy humanity of his own team. The trial was a global sensation. The School of Turin sat in a glass-walled courtroom in Antwerp, facing the evidence of their impossible crime. Julian Vane remained stoic, his bespoke suit still sharp, his posture still that of a prince. But the merchant of Turin was gone, replaced by a man who had become a legend for all the wrong reasons. He was sentenced to 10 years in a high-security Belgian prison. His crew received similar sentences. The $100 million in diamonds, however, was never recovered. Julian refused to speak of their location, holding on to the last piece of his pride, the fact that while they had his body, they didn't have his prize. Prison was the ultimate resolution for a man who lived for the thrill of the open door. The man who could bypass any lock was now behind a door that required no sensors, only a guard with a simple iron key. Years passed. Rocco, guilt-ridden, eventually confessed his role in the roadside mistake, but Julian never forgave him. For Julian, the failure wasn't the crime itself, it was the sloppiness. In the yard of the prison, Julian would often be seen staring at the horizon, his fingers moving in the air as if dialing a combination lock. He had wanted to be the man who pulled off the absolute score. He had wanted the world to see his intellect. In a cruel twist of fate, he got exactly what he wanted. He was famous, but as a cautionary tale rather than a conqueror. When he was finally released, he was an old man. The merchant of Turin was a ghost of the past. He walked out of the prison gates with nothing but a small bag of personal items. He returned to Antwerp one last time, standing outside the Diamond Center, which now featured even more layers of security, sensors designed specifically to counter the techniques he had invented. He smiled. He had changed the world of security forever. He had proven the vault could be beaten. As he walked away into the rain, he reached into his pocket and felt the small, smooth surface of a single rough diamond he had managed to swallow on the day of his arrest. He was poor, he was aged, and he was alone. But as he looked at the diamond in the palm of his hand, Julian Vane knew that for one night, he had been a god. And for a man with his flaw, that was almost enough to pay the price.